All right. We will continue on now with Ledge Counsel. Damian Leonard is here, and we had asked Damian to pull together some information on the sort of the agricultural labor market in the state. So how many employers are we talking about when we're thinking about what our charge is? Who are we talking about? What kind of agricultural work businesses do they have? And how many employees are there across the different categories? So we zoomed in a little bit earlier on the H-2A visa holders and saw that that number's in the maybe 600 range. So curious to hear whether you have anything more to say about that, but also the rest of the landscape. So thank you for joining us again.
Sure. For the record, I'm Damian Leonard from the Office of Legislative Counsel. Would it make sense for me to answer some of those outstanding questions that Deputy Secretary Eastman threw my way?
If you have the answers.
I do. So the first question was regarding that no strike or lockout language that they had copied from the federal information sheet. So that one, what that means is that you cannot apply to bring in H-2A workers where there is an ongoing strike or lockout. So you basically can't bring them in as replacement workers because in part, you might not be able to guarantee the 3/4, et cetera. So you're not supposed to apply to bring them into an ongoing labor dispute. It's not that you can't guarantee that there won't be a strike while they're there. It's that you can't bring them into the middle of a labor dispute knowingly. So part of the certifications you have to make during the application. And as we'll talk about this afternoon, most states are silent on whether H-2A workers can join a union. California does specifically permit them to join a union under their agricultural collective bargaining law. The other question was regarding what qualifies as agricultural labor under the H-2A program. And let me just see if I can. So the first important thing to note is that agricultural labor under the H-2A program is only those things that are enumerated in the law. So anything that falls outside of that, you're not supposed to allow an H-2A worker to do. That said, the list is long and detailed. It is any services performed on a farm in connection with cultivating the soil, raising or harvesting any agricultural or horticultural commodity, including raising, shearing, feeding, caring for, training, and management of livestock, bees, poultry, and fur-bearing animals, wildlife. Any work in the employ of the owner or tenant or other operator of a farm in connection with operation, management, conservation, improvement, or maintenance of the farm, its tools and equipment, salvaging timber, clearing land or brush or other debris left by a hurricane, if the major part of the service is on the farm. Any service performed in connection with the harvesting or production of any commodity defined as an agricultural commodity in Section 15G of the Federal Agricultural Marketing Act, and I'm not going to go there right now, in connection with cotton ginning, operation and maintenance of ditches, canals, reservoirs, or waterways not owned or operated for profit that are used exclusively for supplying or storing water for farming purposes. So these are on-farm irrigation. And then in the employ of the operator of a farm in handling, planting, drying, packing, packaging, processing, freezing, grading, storing, or delivering to storage or to market or to a carrier for transportation to market in its unmanufactured state, any agricultural or horticultural commodity, but only if the operator of the farm produced more than 1/2 of the amount of the commodity with which the service is performed or in relation to which the service is performed, You can also perform these services for a group of farms, or other than a cooperative organization. And then the one other thing that, with respect to manufacturing, you mentioned cider. Pressing apples into cider is considered agricultural work and not manufacturing work. But donuts, I think that might be manufacturing work. So it is detailed. It is somewhat confusing, I would say, particularly given cross references to the Internal Revenue Code, that other act I cited, the Agricultural Marketing Act. So, and this is an area that I'm not an expert in, but the general gist of it is if it's related to producing a raw farm product, meat, eggs, fur, or wool, or some sort of crop or horticultural commodity, then you're okay. Once you get into production of some sort of finished product where you've changed it, making pizzas on the farm, making jams, jellies, etc., those sort of products, you're getting into a different class of workers.
We should probably investigate the cider donuts more closely.
Did you?
I think you're proposing a taste test at our next hearing.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Jackie, did you want to say something?
I had a question. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Jackie Folsom from the Vermont Farm Bureau. Do you know what the definition of livestock is?
So they don't define livestock within this particular section of the Code of Federal Regulations, so I'm not sure how broadly they define it. It is in the list of livestock, bees, poultry, and fur-bearing animals and wildlife. What particularly are you thinking of?
Equine, I was asking about equine.
And I don't know if they consider equine to be livestock. That would probably require more digging here.
That's fine, thank you.
Yeah, so that is something that may be worth looking at, particularly if that becomes a concern as you're going deeper, is how broadly do we define livestock? As we'll talk about this afternoon, a lot of other states, or some other states that have agricultural collective bargaining, cross-reference back to a federal statute. So if you're doing that, you always want to know what it encompasses. That said, I'll get to what is I think the lighter presentation for the day of the two. It's always adventurous of you to schedule your more boring presentations for after lunch in the afternoon in a warm room. So I'm gonna suggest that everybody has some coffee or tea with lunch. All right, let me share my screen here, and we'll do what for me is fun, because I get to do charts and graphs instead of words and laws for a little bit this morning. So let's get right into the Vermont farm statistics. Vermont, according to the 2022 USDA Census of Agriculture, Vermont has 6,537 farms. As we know, that number is changing and possibly decreasing. So take these numbers with a grain of salt here. Some of these farms may no longer be with us just because of the amount of time it takes between when they gather this data and when it's published. Total agricultural land is a little over 1.1 million acres. The average farm has about 180 acres in Vermont. We have just over $1 billion in market value of agricultural products sold. As you'll see, this is significantly more than the actual net income to farms in Vermont. So the total net income net farm income in Vermont is 310,620,000. And this is again measured by USDA. I can't tell you that this is actually what the farmers are taking home at the end of the day. The average net farm income is only $47,517. So that's after expenses, payroll, taxes, etc. The number of hired farm workers in Vermont is 8,331. It's really important to note that there is a very significant, on the order of thousands, of unhired farm workers in Vermont. These are folks who perform labor on the farm for no pay. These might be volunteers from the community. They may be family members of the farmer who work on the farm for no pay. So that's something to keep in mind here. This is not the full universe of farm workers. It's just those who are on payroll. And of the 6,500 farms, only 1,800 have hired farm workers. The rest, it's the farmer and probably family members or volunteers working for no pay. Total farm payroll in the state is 144,357,000. The other thing to note here is that this information will not take into account information that the farmers did not report when they conducted this census. So if a farm worker is paying people under the table, farm worker has undocumented labor that they are keeping off of payroll, that would not go into this. So these numbers may be off there to some extent, to the extent that a farmer did not want to share this data with the U.S. Department of Agriculture. So again, this is all voluntary information that they then aggregated. For those of you who are interested in really deep dive into the data, I can provide you the link to the USDA Census of Agriculture site, and 650 pages of numbers for all 50 states plus the US in total, breaking down all sorts of labor market and agricultural market statistics.
Just add a question in terms of Vermont data. As you look at Vermont farms, is there any statistical data that provide more detail as to the size of the farm, the revenue of the farm, the number of cows it supposedly has, the number of workers, and the payroll? All those numbers individually available on a by farm basis?
Not on a by farm basis that I know of. The data that I was able to access was all aggregated.
Mm-hmm.
We do have information on the size of farms. We do have information on the number of dairy cattle. But I don't know that we have that by farm.
One of the ways, obviously, to test the integrity of data is to look at these statistics on an individual farm basis, and then to look for the anomalies as to whether or not, because the farm that has employees will have very different numbers in terms of its labor size and so on per cow or per even small farm, medium farm, large farm, to be able just to test whether or not the data integrity makes sense. As you mentioned, there may be farms that are not reporting labor, there may be farms that are operating on voluntary labor, there may be farms that are doing everything by the book, but their numbers will probably be different. And indeed, within the groupings, the numbers may be radically different.
Right, and I don't want to imply that there are a significant number of farms that are trying to cheat the system in the state. I think with any business, there are folks who don't play by the book. I don't want to imply that that is a common practice in the state. And I don't know enough about the system. I think your advocates from the agricultural community could speak more to that. Within the data, they've aggregated it so we aren't able to test by farm to say, for example, I know farm X is doing huge work and I see dozens of workers there, and yet they reported that they have 4 hired workers. We just aren't able to, I don't have that data. What I do have is sort of general information on what are the size of the farms, what's our payroll. What we're seeing here is roughly 1 in 3 Vermont farms has hired out the other farms. Apparently the labor force is predominantly family members or community volunteers. What you'll see from even this here is, as we look at this, you're looking at, so these are your farms that are 1 to 9 acres, very small, 10 to 49. So almost probably 40% of our farms are in the 49 acres or less size, which is pretty small. The vast or the plurality of farms are in this 50 to 179 acres. And then you get into about a quarter of the farms are between 180 and 1,000 plus acres. And as you go up in size, they get smaller and smaller. So in terms of land area, we can see that we do have a lot of small farms. And we can see that roughly 3/4 of the farms are under that average farm size, which means that we have some very large farms who bring the average farm size up. And then 3/4 of our farms are in that much smaller farm size. In terms of employees, we can see here on this chart that most farms that have employees are in the 1 to 4 workers range. We're looking at 1,274 farms, roughly 2,600 workers. That said, in the 10 plus workers range, we have 170 farms that account for 3,415 workers. So what we can see again is that there is a small number of larger farms that account for a significant portion, almost half of the farm workers in the state that are hired workers. And then this 5 to 9 worker range here that's a pretty small number of farms for a small portion of workers. So again, while I can't tell you individual farms, we can see that most of our farms are on the very small side. And this is going to be important when we talk about whether you want to put in for your proposed legislation on collective bargaining a minimum farm size. If you put in a needs to have 5 or more workers, you would only be affecting just over 500 farms in the state. And 1,275 of the farms that actually have hired workers wouldn't even be covered by the collective bargaining law if you said has to have 5 or more. So that's something to keep in mind, and that would be consistent with our existing State Labor Relations Act, which says 5 or more. So from a sort of aggregate thinking about this and how do we make policy for the Vermont as a whole, we can do that, get some useful help from this. What we can't see again is that sort of individual farm. Is there an area where we have other issues in terms of whether farms are playing by the books or accurately reporting? So, and again, I don't want to accuse any farms of not doing that. I simply don't know. What I can say from experience with other areas of labor laws, there's always employers who don't play by the book. And you know, same as we have fraud and unemployment claims and so forth. So period of employment, this is an interesting one here. So this is looking at the employees and saying, do you have employees who all your employees work less than 150 days? All your employees work more than 150 days? Or you have some employees who work less than 150 and some that work more than 150? The majority or the plurality, the largest group is working less than 150 days. So these are your seasonal farms, fruit, crops, et cetera, where you may have a large seasonal workload during the growing season, and then that goes away. More than 150 is 558. And then there's a similarly sized group, but it accounts for 50% of the workers that have both more and less. So these may be farms that have a significant year-round operation and then a seasonal push for whatever reason, where they bring in an additional workforce. There have been questions about migrant farm workers. Only 167 farms reported using migrant farm workers, a total of 852 workers. These are not H-2A workers. So this is a separate group from H-2A. These workers are covered under the Migrant and Seasonal Worker Protection Act, which is a federal law, which does not apply to H-2A workers. So they're two separate federal programs. These workers could be US domestic migrant workers. They could be here. They could also be undocumented workers in the country. But these are folks who would potentially, these can be folks who are coming around providing seasonal services, and they move around the United States to provide those services as seasons change and growing moves from north to south and back again. So you'll see some of these workers may be working through contractors. And then that comes into the next statistic here. So most of these farms using migrant workers also have hired labor. So they hire their own staff and then they bring in migrant workers periodically. And then some, only 10, work only with contract labor. So it's the farmer and then they bring in contract labor. So a work crew for a portion of the year, and that only accounted for 42 of the migrant workers. These other workers on farms with hired labor, they could be part of a work crew that just comes through, or they could be a family that gets hired on a seasonal basis and then moves on to another farm.
I'm just wondering, you mentioned that some portion of the migrant workers may be undocumented.
They could be reported, and they could be, it's
Normally,
possible.
you know, it is, from a federal standpoint, it is illegal to hire someone who is undocumented. The requirements are the same unless they are here under some program like H-2A, and they're documented at that point. My experience, at least in looking around Vermont, is undocumented workers don't appear anywhere in statistics because they're not being reported as undocumented.
So I don't know
As
if
employees.
I don't know if immigration status was asked with this question, or it was just do you use migrant workers? So and I can see we have a comment from the Farm Bureau, so I would defer to you.
Jackie, do you want to, just because you're not on camera?
Oh, we're.
No, nobody's on camera at the moment because we've got the presentation up, but do you want to?
What I wanted to do was give a little more background on the ag census, because probably the only people in this room that have ever filled one out are Representative Super, myself. And
But I'm wondering if it would, since you probably are going to have other thoughts than maybe even the ones you got right now, do we want to hold off and schedule you and have you come in and actually share a little bit more from the Bureau's perspective?
the Farm Bureau will be coming in, but this has to do specifically with the statistics that are being offered.
So, if it's helpful, would this capture undocumented workers or not?
Well, that's what I want to give background on, because I actually, Jackie Folsom from Farm Bureau, there is an advisory council that deals with the ag census. And I was president of that council for 6 years. And I will tell you that the makeup of that council is 90% people from universities that use the statistics for their research. There were only 2 actual farmers on that committee, and I was one of them, and a rancher from Montana was the other one. The questions that they ask are not geared to making it easy for farmers to answer them at all. They are geared towards research. And so some of the questions are very ambiguous, and I haven't seen, I don't remember the last one, whether it had anything about documented or undocumented workers. The other piece I wanted to say to Senator Brock's point is they are aggregated, but you can find county information, but that's as deep as you can go because it is all proprietary. It's information that the government owns and they don't share mine or yours with anybody, and that's just to be aware of. So you can get Franklin County information if you're interested, which would help you maybe look at, because you have dairy farms up there.
Sure.
But what I wanted to say is that the statistics that come out of that aren't always things that prove one thing or another because of the way they're asked. They're very, very ambiguous. One of the questions that used to be on there was, and it used to drive the academia people crazy, was they would ask a farmer, how many total acres do you have? How many do you hay? And how many do you pasture? Well, we do it differently depending on weather, animals, but that wasn't broken down. So it's very hard sometimes when you're looking at statistics like this to say, okay, that's it. And are we answering it correctly? Sometimes we're not because we don't know how to. And so the questions are not, and I should say the last thing is the census actually, and farmers understand that the way you answer those questions also assists states in getting, I don't want to say subsidies, but help from the federal government when there are disasters, when there are things that happen. They use that and we say, oh, you've got this many farmers, you've got this much crop land. And that's how the federal dollars flow into the states based on the information that we give them. So it isn't a user-friendly form, and we have tried to fix it, but it's a hard road to hoe. So that was the background I just wanted to give on the ag census. Farm Bureau will be glad to come in later and give our opinion on this whole thing, but I wanted to just clarify that.
Yeah, and I appreciate that clarification. I want to say too, I'm going to steer away from speculating about documented or undocumented status because I don't know enough. And I don't want to imply something here. And I think there are witnesses you're going to hear from on the issues of the workforce who are actually working with the workforce, who can speak better to the use of documented or undocumented work in Vermont than I can. And I don't want to muddy the waters with the stamp of legislative council on it.
I think that
I'm just going to move away from that.
Yeah.
And I
Expertise is not in.
it's not. And so I'm going to try to stop speculating about what goes into these numbers.
But Damien, can you just be sure that we're all understanding, however, that there are possibly authorized workers falling into this category
Oh, absolutely.
through something other than you said this is not H2A.
Yeah, so this is essentially a separate grouping of workers. These are workers who travel from farm to farm. They migrate to perform agricultural services on the farms. They can be very common in industries where there's a big seasonal surge, and they will move around the country to provide services in relation to whatever seasonal surge. And that they are captured separately under federal law. There's a separate Migrant and Seasonal Worker Protection Act that has requirements. We talked about it at our first meeting. It has requirements around housing and contracts and other things like that, similar to H2A, but they're separate programs. They don't overlap. And
in fact, they're migrant in the sense that they're moving from farm to farm. We don't necessarily know anything about their citizenship.
Right, and so that I think was what I was trying to get at, is we don't know their citizenship or documented status, or whether farmers are reporting migrant workers.
But they could also be American citizens. There's nothing that suggests
Absolutely,
at all where they were born or what passport they hold.
right, and the other important thing to note is, for purposes of federal employment documentation, you just need to have something that appears to be a valid document. So the farmer may not have any idea. Beyond that, I took what appears to be the valid documents that I'm supposed to collect for purposes of federal tax purposes. I collected taxes and paid them. And these workers have been coming back and working for me for several years, and they do good work. And that's all they know. So, but yeah, that, I think I was straying too far afield, and I apologize for that.
That's perfectly fine.
But let me stick to the numbers. Speaking of that county data, number of farms by county. This is, I think, most helpful just to see where our farming is focused in terms of the number of farms, and then we'll look at acreage. Essex and Grand Isle counties are the smallest number of farms. That makes sense from a population standpoint too. Our biggest farming sectors are in Franklin County and Addison County. And then there are Windsor, Orange, Rutland, and Orleans are all in 4,000 to 5,000 farms range. And then Chittenden and Caledonia County and Washington County are in that 3,000 to 4,000 range. And then Windham, Lamoille, Bennington, you start to diminish in your number of farms. Your farm acreage.
Sorry, just wanted to do a reality check here. These seem large, these numbers seem.
Yeah, actually, they seem very large.
Yeah.
I'm wondering why.
It was 6,537.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Let me back check and see if I somehow got the wrong data on here. I'll come back to that.
Okay,
Apologize. I'm not sure where that came from. Yeah, thank you. Farm acreage. Yeah. I'm wondering if the farm acreage got transposed with the number of farms, because that seems more accurate. Let me come back to this whole piece. In fact, I'll pull it up from Vermont Labor Market Information. Had the same data on their report. I'll pull that up at the end of this presentation.
okay.
I think what I did is I flipped acreage and number of farms. Because if you look at this adds up to 6,000 or so, roughly. Number of farms by state. Now we're getting into what I did here is one of your charges is to look at states that are similar to Vermont. So I took the USDA data and I looked at the 14 states that have agricultural collective bargaining. I added Maine in because their legislature passed an agricultural collective bargaining law in 2021. It was vetoed by their governor in 2022. And so I've pulled that in because Maine is actually probably the closest to Vermont in terms of the agricultural sector. And they actually enacted a full agricultural law. So it's something for you to use as an example of another state with a small, somewhat similar agricultural sector. Big thing we can see here is there are these states like California, Kentucky, Kansas, Wisconsin that have absolutely enormous numbers of farms. And then you get down to Vermont with just 6,500, Maine with 7,000, Massachusetts 7,000, Hawaii with 6,500, and New Jersey with just under 10,000. So much smaller agricultural sectors in those states. When you get to farm acreage, again, we can see really similar thing. There are these states that are way out here getting out to almost 45 million acres of farmland in Kansas. And then you get back down to Vermont, New Jersey, Massachusetts, Maine, and Hawaii. Again, we're seeing very small farm acreage in those states. Average farm acreage, this gets a little closer for some of these states. You can see Arizona here, 1,500. I assume that's because of ranching. Colorado, 800, Kansas, 800, Nebraska, almost 1,000. But then you get into California, despite having an agricultural sector that absolutely dwarfs Vermont's in terms of the overall size. The average farm size is only about double the average farm size in Vermont. And then looking at states like Massachusetts and New Jersey, the average farm is actually much smaller than the average farm in Vermont. And so this may be another way to measure it. New York has an agricultural collective bargaining law. Even though it's a much bigger state, much bigger agricultural sector, their farms are only slightly larger than Vermont's. Maine, very close to Vermont again. So just another way of comparing them. Market value, this is just another way of saying that states like California, Nebraska, and Kansas are just on a completely different level than Vermont. You'll notice Vermont, Maine, Massachusetts, Hawaii, they barely show up as a blip on market value comparison. Total hired farm workers, the story is the same. We're talking over 350,000 farm workers in California, whereas most states are well under 50,000 farm workers. And as we know, Vermont's under 10,000. So again, you'll see Vermont is very close to Maine, Hawaii, and Massachusetts in terms of its farm labor scale. New Jersey actually has significantly more, and I'm not sure why that is. They have a very small agricultural sector, but a large number of hired farm workers. Number of farms by workforce size. So what I did here again is breaking it down by 10 or more workers, 5 to 9 workers, 1 to 4 workers, which is how the census breaks it down. You'll notice for most states, there's this sort of slope from small farm to large farm. California is kind of the other way, where a significant number of their farms are 10 or more. Same with Washington State. And I think that's because what you're seeing out there are usually much larger West Coast operations. But Vermont, Maine, Massachusetts, New Jersey, to some extent, although it has a little blip here with larger farms, and then Hawaii are all on this sort of mostly very small farms and then some larger farms. Farms using H-2A workers by state. So this is from US Customs and Immigration Service. Their data that's posted on their website says we have 75 farms that are using H-2A in the state, which actually puts us well ahead of those other marker states I was mentioning. Massachusetts and Maine are both in the 20s. New Jersey is just under 50. Wisconsin is another low one at 36. And then I left Hawaii off of this. I apologize for that. So I don't know what their data is on use of H-2A. Interestingly, Arizona, which has a very large agricultural sector, uses less H-2A or has less operations using H-2A than Vermont, for whatever reason. And then the total H-2A workers by state, though, despite having fewer operations, you'll notice that Arizona uses 5 times as many actual workers. So the operations that are using H-2A are using a lot versus Vermont using a fairly small number. But again, this will draw some similarities for Vermont and Maine, both under 500 in terms of their H-2A usage. So that's the end of that presentation. I promised that I would give you the corrected charts. So let me just see if I can find, I had.
Yeah.
Sorry, while he's looking that up, I just was on the Ag Census site, and the question that they ask are how many hired workers and how many contracted laborers. So there is no breakdown on there regarding documented, undocumented H2A, it's just who is working on your farm.
So if you give me just a second here, I'll share the data from our Department of Labor's Labor Market Information Division.
Yes, Brian, this is Roger
Sorry.
Block at the Beer King. I've got a note on my board to give you a call.
Well.
It's $1.
So, and then let me, sorry about that. There we go. Yeah, they actually took the information from them. I think they transposed their information. And then, because they're showing 5,000 farms in Franklin County, and we know that that's not accurate from USDA.
This is 1924 data.
So let's see here, USDA will have state by county. I can find that information for you over the lunch break and pull it up with the USDA information because they have a breakdown by county. And so for those of you who are interested, their Census of Agriculture data, they have 57 tables that are available comparing the states, and just the hired farm labor table to give you an example here is the data is incredibly dense. So this is the start of the table. If we pop down to Vermont, which is on page 9, you'll see that, let me zoom this in so that we can actually all see it. Is that big enough to read?
Yes.
Okay. So you'll see here, they've got the breakdown, 1,800 farms, the payroll by $1,000, farms with certain number of workers. And so this is the table I primarily used, the migrant workers, and then the unpaid workers, 2,500 unpaid workers versus what was it, 1,800 paid workers. So that gives you a sense of, these are folks that the farms are reporting worked on the farm, but that they don't receive a paycheck. They could be a family member, they could be a volunteer, et cetera. And so that gives you a sense, most workers on a farm in Vermont are not actually doing it for pay, according to the census data here. But this gives you a sense of how dense the information is. There was a question earlier about the cattle and calves. They have whole tables devoted to different types of goats, cattle and calves, harvested cropland, field crops, other crops. So you can really drill down to the extent that the questions were understandable. The data will be helpful, but understanding that this is the survey questions may not always line up with reality for the farmer.
So with that caveat then, can you drill down and see how many farm workers or how many farms there are raising cattle versus sheep?
Yep.
Or is it just talking about the number of acres?
So if we look down at, say, cattle and calves, we'll go down to page 19. Oh, too far. All right, so they will break down the data here. Let me zoom this in again. So it's legible. So 1,600 farms, 1,691 farms reported having cattle and calves in 2022. 5 years earlier, that was 2,317 farms. So that gets to the consolidation question. And then the inventory. You'll see, again, they break it down by the number. But we'll say, so a herd of 200 to 499, we've dropped from 133 to 101. A herd of 500 or more, we dropped from 107 farms to 98. They then break down beef cows and then milk cows. So we'll see farms that had milk cows went from 841 to 528 in over 5 years, and presumably that's continued to fall. So we are seeing hits to the dairy industry. And then, so they'll do this for each of them. You would have to go table by table by table to try to break it out, poultry versus cows versus goats, et cetera. And with goats, strangely enough, they break out goats by all goats, milk goats, Angora goats, meat goats, and other goats. There's a lot of information on goats in this survey for whatever reason. They do break out equine, they break out poultry, they break out honeybees, aquaculture, miscellaneous livestock, and then they get into field crops, hay, et cetera, which I'm sure hay is a significant.
Is there employment data at that detailed level?
The employment data, unfortunately, they get down to number of workers. They don't get down to number of workers by industry that I'm aware of. I'd have to drill down in state and county. You can also break that down here. So if we click on Vermont by state and county, we can then go, let's see, 2022 Vermont County. So we can go hired farm labor by county. Again, what we're seeing is the same sort of the use of migrant workers, unpaid workers, et cetera. But it's the same basic questions. We're not seeing how many of these workers are on dairy farms versus, a farm that's got a diversified CSA or something like that. And so we aren't really getting that idea of if you decided to permit collective bargaining at, let's say, farms with 10 or more employees, who would that hit? This data can't tell us that. So that's where you need to hear from farmers and farm workers about which farms are actually going to be affected by that. And that, unfortunately, is just the limitations in the data that's out there. I have been in periodic contact actually with a researcher in Maine who's working on similar work in Maine, who was trying to get data for Vermont and asking me if I have anything else. And unfortunately, the answer is there's just not a lot out there. And one of the limitations I've run into, at least in the legal scholarship, is it's very much written from a slant on one side or the other of issues of farm employment laws or farm regulation. And so it's very hard to get unbiased information from the legal scholarship. I don't know if there's economic scholarship or something like that, or ag school scholarship that might provide more sort of unbiased information. It's really challenging, though, to look at the legal scholarship because very often it's written by an advocate for either additional regulation or additional employment laws, or the opposite, repealing existing regulations or employment laws. And so they cherry pick their data. That's in the articles. And so it's hard to see, are they giving me a complete picture or is this just cherry pick data to support the argument? So that's what we've got. I'm happy to share the links to this for those of you who want to dig deeper and enjoy the numbers.
I just posted that.
Oh, perfect. So that's available. And for the actual land and farms here, we will be looking at table 8, which was that data I provided you with earlier, and this would be the accurate data on the number of farms by county and the land and farms, not what's in my chart. So I apologize. I went from Vermont labor market information there to start that, and then ended up with really skewed data. So.
All right, well, thanks, Damien. I know you're up again after lunch, and we're gonna be looking at a different topic then. Are there any other questions about what we've just seen? Should we break for lunch? All right, we'll be back about 1 o'clock.